start by opening up Photoshop and creating a new file. When you're setting up your document, think about the scale you want to work at, thinking about what the outcome is going to be, how you're going to actually use your print. For instance, if you're making a tiny dollhouse wallpaper, you may want to work at a smaller scale because you're going to be printing it at a really tiny size. Okay, we've got a new document, and I like to just start by adding guides, and I add them to the tops and the bottoms, both sides, and also center guides. I have a snap to grid on sort of automatically so that Photoshop is smart enough to kind of place the grids very normally along these sort of guide points. You can also create your guides manually by going into View, Guides, New Guides. If you're getting into more complicated math, laying out your repeat, you may find that you need to actually input these numbers manually because Photoshop won't easily let you create perfectly placed guides, or they might be off by like the tiniest fraction of an inch and it can throw off the whole repeat. Sometimes it's just easier to input them manually here. The other thing to pay attention to as you're moving elements around in your repeat block is that you really want to make sure that your guides are locked. If they're not locked, let me show you first what it looks like if they're not locked. If they're not locked and you're moving objects around, it's really easy to accidentally move your guide also, and you might not even notice it, especially if it's off by just a tiny amount. And this again can lead to repeats that are slightly off. Okay, so lock those guides. For the sake of speeding things up, I've already prepared a file that has some elements in it. Okay, so in this file, I've added a color, and I've brought in all of these elements. I like to work with digitally cut out scans of paintings. So these are oil paintings that were done on paper, scanned, and then by hand cut out. If you work digitally, it'll be easier to remove the background or work without a background. If you work in traditional techniques, you will probably find yourself spending a lot of time cutting out elements. You may have a different way of working where the background is invisible without cutting it out, but I find that this gives me the most control over the individual elements. Okay, so I have all these different elements and I've got this block. Make sure that my guides are locked. They're not. To start a pattern, I usually take all of these elements, I kind of lay them out, I look at them, I look at how the shapes relate to each other, and I start thinking about what kind of pattern I want to make. In this one, I'm going to start by doing a real simple repeat with just kind of a bouquet of flowers, essentially, and repeating that in a sort of pleasing manner that is fairly organic and uses all these different shapes and colors. So I start moving things around. This stage can take a lot of time of just Command T of your object, moving it, rotating it. I also I tend to have a lot of layers, and I've found that spending the extra time to name them makes my life a lot easier because otherwise I'm going around turning things off trying to find my individual elements. I've got these little flowers here. Yeah, and I just play around with this for quite a while, sometimes hours and hours, until I wind up with something maybe like this. So here's just a nice bouquet element that fills the space nicely. So at this point, we can kind of see what this will look like as just the simplest block repeat. So this whole square is your block. Right now it's a square block. There's some negative space around here, but not really at the top. We're going to see what this is going to look like. So Photoshop has this feature called Define Pattern. You don't have to name your patterns. I really find no reason to. So I've now defined this image that you're seeing right here, this tile, as a pattern. So now I'm going to have to make a new one, a new document, and I'm going to make it twice the size so I can see this actually repeating. So the first document I made was 15 inches. I'm going to make this 30. And now I'm going to fill this document with that pattern I just created. And to do that, you just click on your paint bucket tool and you change it from foreground to pattern. And that gives you this swatch library of patterns. It doesn't seem to save all of them perfectly, but I do have a lot of saved ones here. And then I'm just going to get myself in the habit of creating a new layer and filling. So now you can see what that pattern looks like when it's repeated 4 times. This block is 4 times on this grid. And it's pretty boring. It has sort of a nice up and down flow in these lines, but there's a lot of awkward negative space that I'm not crazy about. And so I'm going to start playing around with how I would fill this space. One thing I could do really simply is honestly just make this narrower. Let me use this. One note, if you're cropping or changing your canvas size and your guides are locked, they kind of move around with the new canvas and it can get awkward. So the one time I do like to unlock my guides is if I'm like enlarging the canvas to show sort of space around my working area, or shrinking it like this, because then it'll sort of preserve the dimensions and the placement of the guides. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. So I'm just going to crop this. I'm also going to try just having this take up a little less space. Okay, now I'm going to define this pattern again. And let's see what that looks like. Fill tool, pattern, and choose the latest swatch. Okay, so it's still pretty awkward. Yeah, I don't love it. It's really very basic and boring. You could do something with like an interesting stripe if your elements were connected and have it repeat like this, but I want to get more exciting. So I'm just going to undo what I just did and go back to my previous version. And remember to save occasionally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a half drop repeat. So right now you can see, if we put in guides, it's just a straight repeat. 1, 2, 3, 4.